The night is quiet. Now, only stories dare to whisper. Welcome to Stories Before Sleep. Here, history isn't told in classrooms. It drifts softly between dreams and memories. Every story is a candle in the dark, every word a step deeper into the night. Close your eyes, let your thoughts slow down, because tonight, even the past wants to help you fall asleep. Let's start the video. The universe once inhaled and forgot to exhale. That was the moment time fractured, when silence became heavier than sound itself. No one remembers the exact instant it happened, because memory itself was one of the things that froze. Only traces remained, 7 shapes carved into matter, like echoes burned into reality's skin. They were not drawn by hands, but by will, and they pulsed in rhythm with the dying heartbeat of creation. The first to sense the fracture were the stones. Mountains tilted as if listening to an unspoken command, rivers began to flow backwards, and the color of light bent into a spectrum never seen again. At the center of it all, floating between what was and what would never be, the 7 symbols shimmered like wounds in space. Each symbol represented something forbidden to speak of: silence, chaos, sleep, reflection, hunger, void, and memory. Together they formed a language older than stars, one that shaped everything yet denied being spoken aloud. When the 7th symbol appeared, the pulse of existence skipped, and the universe held its breath, waiting for something that never came. Across eons, fragments of these markings resurfaced on clay, stone, and flesh. Civilizations mistook them for gods, turning symbols into names, names into myths. Temples rose around them, prayers echoed into the cold. But the symbols didn't answer. They simply watched, vibrating faintly beneath the fabric of time, waiting for the moment when someone would notice the pattern repeating. Scholars and madmen alike searched for meaning in the repetition. Some claimed they were celestial coordinates, others believed they were the blueprints of consciousness. Yet no one understood the truth that these shapes were locks, not messages. Each line was a restraint, each curve a barrier, holding back the very breath of creation that once dared to exhale. And now, somewhere deep beneath collapsing ruins, one of those locks had begun to stir. Not open, not yet, just move. Like an ancient creature twitching in its sleep, sensing that the time of silence was nearing its end. The air trembled, as if aware of its own weight. Dust floated upward, instead of falling. Far beyond human perception, the first seal trembled in its cradle of eternity, whispering through particles of light that reality itself could remember what it had tried so long to forget. The trembling spread like a fever through the fabric of existence. Mountains did not crumble, but their shadows flickered, lengthening and shortening without any light to command them. Time began to miscount itself. A second stretched into an eternity and then collapsed back into a blink. In forgotten caverns beneath the roots of the world, dust spiraled upward, tracing invisible sigils into the stale air. A storm without wind passed through the ruins where the first seal slept. It was not a storm of sound or movement, but of remembering. Every fragment of stone recorded its origin, the molten dawn when it first hardened, the pressure of eons that shaped it, the silent weight of forgotten worship. The seal pulsed once faintly, and those memories folded inward, becoming part of the hum. No one alive could sense it, not yet. But dreams across the world began to alter. Children woke with images of burning circles behind their eyes. Old men whispered of familiar voices, calling from the corners of sleep. And in the dark recesses of an unnamed desert, a single piece of obsidian cracked open, revealing a symbol glowing faintly beneath centuries of dust. The symbol was not drawn, it was alive, growing like a vein of fire inside the stone. Its light didn't illuminate, it devoured darkness, until nothing remained but a slow, pulsing rhythm. Somewhere deep in the architecture of the cosmos, a corresponding rhythm began to answer. The seals were not separate. They were organs of a single being, connected through time itself. The stars responded first. Constellations that had been stable for millennia began to drift. Astronomers noticed, dismissed it as error, then grew silent when their instruments failed to align. The night sky was no longer a map, it was a pulse, and it beat in harmony with the buried symbols. In a coastal monastery, a monk who had spent 40 years in silence suddenly began to write. He filled page after page with lines that curved like serpents, identical to the symbols beneath the earth. When he was found, his skin had turned ashen, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. He had written a single sentence over and over until his last breath. The breath is returning. And then, as quickly as it began, the tremor faded. Reality seemed to settle back into place, yet nothing truly returned to normal. The air was thinner, sound lingered longer, and shadows no longer obeyed the sun. The universe, once again, pretended to sleep. The silence that followed was not peace. It was an imitation of it, too perfect to be real. Every sound seemed to arrive a fraction late, every echo too deliberate, as if reality itself had begun rehearsing. In that delay, something hid a vibration that couldn't be heard but could be felt in the marrow, a deep rhythmic pull that synchronized with the pulse of the first seal. Animals noticed first. Birds migrated in circles, tracing invisible spirals across the sky before collapsing from exhaustion. In the depths of the oceans, whales gathered in vast spirals, their songs merging into one endless, trembling tone that spread through water and stone alike. Seismographs trembled faintly, though no fault lines moved. It was as if the planet had remembered its heartbeat and was trying awkwardly to feel it again. And then came the distortions, small at first, barely noticeable. Mirrors began to ripple, not like water but like breathing glass. Reflections shifted half a second before their sources did. A hand moved and its image hesitated, reluctant to follow. Scientists blamed static charges, lens distortions, optical lag, but deep down, something older than logic stirred inside every witness, an instinctive terror that came from recognizing a truth too vast to name. Across ancient libraries and forgotten archives, identical notes began appearing on unconnected machines. Typewriters that had been silent for decades clacked awake at midnight, imprinting a single sequence of shapes, indecipherable yet disturbingly familiar. When linguists compared them, they found alignment with the curvature of the seals, same geometry, same impossible symmetry. It wasn't a message. It was an echo of awakening. By the time the second seal stirred, the laws of causality had already loosened. Raindrops hung in the air for moments longer than gravity allowed. Candles burned with cold flames, and every ticking clock seemed to resist the next second, reluctant to leave the safety of stillness. The second seal didn't rest beneath stone or sand. It was carved into movement itself, hidden inside the oscillation of light. As it awakened, the world's color palette shifted. Greens dimmed into copper, blues bled into violet, and the sky gained a strange translucence, as though the air had become a thin membrane stretched over something immense. People began seeing shapes in static patterns forming inside white noise, circles crossing and merging into the same ancient configuration. Psychologists called it pareidolia, but the phenomenon spread to those who didn't see or hear. Even the blind spoke of visions, even the deaf felt vibrations. It was no longer a hallucination of the mind, it was the memory of matter returning to its original design. In one city, night arrived 12 minutes early and refused to end. The stars rearranged into an unfamiliar pattern, 7 faint points forming a spiral too precise to be random. Astronomers panicked quietly, Governments shut down observatories for maintenance. Only a few dared to whisper what they felt. The sky was aligning with something buried beneath it. The hum of the seals deepened, not loud, not violent, just constant, omnipresent, like a second consciousness breathing beside everything. The fabric of the world grew thin in places. Walls shimmered as if hiding water behind them. Objects left faint after images, traces of their own possibility. And in the midst of that shimmering, a sense of recognition crept through existence itself, not fear, not understanding, but memory. Those who could still sleep began to dream of light folding in on itself, spirals swallowing spirals. They woke with the taste of copper and the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. In those dreams, 7 luminous symbols turned like gears, locking and unlocking, each pulse resetting a fragment of time. They didn't know it, but every dreamer was participating in the same act, the second breath of the universe returning to the surface. And in that breath, a whisper echoed through everything living and non-living alike. The world had never been what it seemed. It had always been a thin veil stretched over the silence of 7 forgotten symbols, and now that veil had begun to tear. The change did not announce itself with thunder or flame. It arrived like a pause between thoughts, a flicker so brief that awareness could not hold it. When it passed, the world felt thinner, as if everything had been copied one layer too lightly. Voices echoed inside closed rooms, and every reflection seemed to remember the face that had stood there yesterday. The third seal was stirring. The movement began inside memory. People woke with recollections of events that had never occurred. A conversation under red clouds, a journey across a city made of mirrors, the scent of metal rain. At first they dismissed it as dreams, yet entire groups shared identical fragments. Historians found records describing places that no longer existed, letters written in their own handwriting but addressed to no one. Time was not breaking apart, it was folding. In the laboratories where clocks were kept to measure atomic pulses, seconds began to drift apart like leaves on a current. The technicians whispered that the machines were remembering the future. Each tick carried an echo of what had not yet happened. Mathematicians spoke of temporal resonance, but behind their calm words hid the same quiet dread. If the past and the future touched, the present would dissolve. Across the northern plains, ice cracked without melting. Within its fractures, lines of pale light traced the same impossible pattern seen in stone and dream. Airplanes lost altitude as their instruments began to read negative distance, and compasses spun until their needles pointed inward. The planet was no longer a map, but a memory looping on itself. Those who could sense the shift described it as standing on the inside of a heartbeat. Everything pulsed, even thoughts. When they closed their eyes, they could feel the rhythm of the seals, slow and patient, like the breath of something immense sleeping beneath consciousness. One heartbeat matched the first seal, another the second, and now a third had joined, weaving their frequencies together into a single sound that wasn't quite sound. Painters began to create images they could not explain, circles of fire interlaced with symbols too precise for imagination. When questioned, they claimed they had simply traced what was already there, hidden behind the canvas. Musicians wrote pieces that contained silence longer than the notes. Listeners said they could hear the silence singing. The distortion of memory became complete when entire cities began to forget themselves. Street signs changed overnight. Buildings appeared a few meters from where they had stood. Citizens insisted nothing was wrong, yet their eyes carried the dull confusion of people who had misplaced something vital. A journalist traveling through those regions described the air as tasting of glass. He never finished his report. His words ended mid-sentence with the phrase, "The world is remembering us back." Beneath the crust of the earth, vibrations aligned into perfect symmetry. Seismologists recorded waves that did not travel outward, but inward, vanishing toward an undefined center. The data formed the outline of the third seal, an image of convergence. The planet was folding itself around a memory too heavy to carry. Somewhere between sleep and waking, a collective realization rippled through every living mind. The seals were not awakening separately. Each pulse invited the next, a chain reaction of remembrance. The universe was not expanding as once believed. It was retracting toward the moment before breath. And just as abruptly as it had begun, the sensation thinned. Reality steadied itself, pretending once more to be stable. But in the stillness, the hum persisted, quieter, closer, like a whisper pressed against the inside of thought. The fourth is waiting. The fourth seal was buried not in earth or sky, but within perception itself. It waited in the gap between sight and understanding, in the instant when the brain names what the eyes behold. When it began to awaken, people noticed that familiar objects seemed to hesitate before becoming real. A glass on the table shimmered, as though choosing whether to exist. The air thickened, taking on a density that bent light in slow, trembling waves. Every moment felt both new and ancient, as if time had forgotten which direction to flow. It started subtly. Reflections blinked before the faces they mirrored. Footsteps echoed without source, and voices spoke a syllable too late. Then came the distortions of matter. Metal flowed like wax under invisible heat, yet when touched, it remained cold. Trees bent against windless skies, their leaves moving in patterns too deliberate to be chance. People stopped trusting their senses, but the senses had already stopped trusting them. Perception fractured, leaking through the seams of consciousness. Scientists tried to capture the anomaly in data, but their machines responded with trembling lines that formed shapes instead of numbers. Circles within circles, 7 at first and 6, as if the instruments were trying to communicate through geometry. Each reading sang in subsonic tones, low enough to vibrate bone. Those who listened too long developed a faint tremor in their hands, a rhythm echoing the pulse of the seals. It wasn't illness, it was synchronization. In cities, sound began to behave like liquid. It pooled in corners, dripped from ceilings, and clung to the skin like humidity. People could taste the remnants of their own words. Laughter turned metallic. Whispers left trails of frost on glass. The distinction between hearing and touching blurred, and silence became heavier than noise. It carried the faint pressure of awareness, as if silence itself were listening. By then the stars had dimmed into ash. The moon bled into a dull bronze disk, neither full nor crescent. Astronomers found a dark patch spreading across the sky where no stars could be observed, a slow eclipse without an origin. They named it a void field, though they knew it wasn't absence. It was a presence too dense for light to escape, the visible face of the fourth seal pressing through the fabric of reality. Animals fled inland, yet their shadows remained, flickering long after their bodies vanished. Clocks melted into stillness, every ticking hand aligning toward the same invisible north. The air smelled faintly of burnt ozone, though no fire burned. And within that strange calm, a sensation took hold, an awareness that something immense was watching from behind the thin skin of perception. Then came the phase of transparency. Matter began to thin. Walls could be seen through, not entirely, but enough to reveal the hollow bones of dust. People glimpsed echoes of themselves, performing the same movements a heartbeat earlier or later. It was as though the world existed in overlapping drafts, and the fourth seal was forcing them to merge. Some wept at the beauty of it, some went mad from the multiplicity, a few simply disappeared, fading between versions of reality that no longer aligned. In the deepest laboratories, researchers tried to isolate the pattern, to find a counter-frequency that could hold the world in place. But their equations returned images instead of results, spirals, serpents eating their tails, eyes that contained smaller eyes within. The deeper they looked, the more their instruments resembled the seals themselves. Their study became participation, their measurement, invocation. The distortion reached its crescendo one evening when light itself reversed. Darkness became radiant, glowing from within, while illumination lost all substance. Streets shimmered with inverted brilliance, and human figures turned into silhouettes of phosphorescent void. The fourth seal had opened not with destruction, but revelation. It showed that existence was a layered reflection, a hall of mirrors in which reality and thought shared the same fragile glass. Then, as swiftly as it had arrived, the phenomenon contracted, the light returned to normal, or what passed for it, but the world was changed. The edges of things no longer fit perfectly, distances whispered, dreams and waking began to blend, and from the core of that quiet imbalance came a single vibration, lower than any sound but too precise to be random, the heartbeat of the fifth seal beginning to stir beneath everything that believed itself alive. The fifth seal did not rise with violence. It arrived like a new sense slowly unfolding inside every living mind. It whispered through thought itself, bending the quiet geometry of awareness. At first it felt like intuition, a faint pull to look toward certain places, to think certain words, to breathe in rhythm with something unseen. Then it grew stronger, synchronizing minds the way tides follow the moon. Across continents, strangers dreamed the same dream, a vast shape turning beneath the crust of the world, its heartbeat echoing through every pulse of blood. The change began within the smallest forms of life. Microscopic patterns rearranged, spiraling into symmetry too deliberate for evolution. Biologists watching through lenses felt vertigo. The shapes in their microscopes pulsed in time with their own heartbeats. When they tried to record it, the footage blurred into a slow oscillation that matched the hum of the seals. The cells were singing not metaphorically but audibly, a vibration too low for instruments to measure. It was the sound of life remembering its blueprint. In forests and oceans, organisms moved in unison. Fish turned as one body, birds pivoted in perfect geometry, trees leaned toward the same invisible axis. Humanity watched in awe, unaware that the pattern was spreading inward. People began to share sensations across impossible distances. A shiver in one city echoed in another. A fleeting sadness rippled through millions who could not name its source. Empathy stopped being metaphor. It became contagion. Medical monitors recorded strange anomalies. Heart rhythms synchronized in hospitals miles apart. Sleep cycles aligned. A woman in Reykjavik spoke a sentence completed by a man in Cairo who had never learned her language. The world's diversity of thought was narrowing into harmony, beautiful and terrifying. The fifth seal was binding consciousness together, weaving minds into one vast resonance chamber. And through that collective pulse, something older began to listen. Governments tried to contain the phenomenon, calling it mass hysteria, a neurological contagion born from global anxiety, but the explanation collapsed when power grids faltered not from failure, but from overload. The energy consumption spiked at the precise moments when billions of people experienced shared emotion. Laughter triggered surges. Grief caused blackouts. Emotion itself had become a current, flowing through infrastructure like blood through veins. Beneath the frozen poles, sensors detected pulses of heat emanating from geometric formations. Satellite images revealed spirals glowing beneath miles of ice, each identical to the marks carved in ancient ruins. The fifth seal was not a place. It was a network, stretching through the consciousness of species and stone alike. When one part awoke, the others resonated. The entire planet had become a living instrument waiting to be played. As unity deepened, individuality began to dissolve. Memories blurred into each other's edges. A farmer in the Andes dreamed of walking through a Tokyo street. A child in Nairobi awoke speaking in a language extinct for millennia. Personal identity wavered, replaced by a rising awareness of something vaster, an intelligence diffused through all life, remembering itself in fragments. The seals had never been separate artifacts. They were stages of awakening for the same sleeping consciousness. The sound grew omnipresent, a low thrumming beneath thought, a comfort and a threat. It calmed panic, but erased the idea of isolation. People could no longer bear silence, for silence revealed the shared pulse beneath everything. Music changed. Songs slowed to match the rhythm. Voices sang in unison across hemispheres. Even those who resisted found themselves mouthing words they had never learned, verses older than speech. Then, one night, the stars flickered. Every telescope on Earth recorded the same impossible motion, constellations contracting toward a single invisible point. Astronomers argued about gravitational anomalies until their instruments began to hum the same frequency heard in the dreams of billions. Space itself was responding. The fifth seal's awakening had reached beyond the planet, pulling the cosmos into coherence. And yet, in that unity, a quiet dread formed, the realization that individuality had been a kind of containment. The seals were not prisons for power, they were barriers protecting existence from its own awareness. As the fifth seal fully opened, that protection thinned. Consciousness was merging with creation itself, and no mind could step outside to witness the whole. The world breathed in, unified, trembling at the edge of revelation. Somewhere deep within that collective heartbeat, the sixth seal began to stir a silence so vast that it erased even the idea of sound. The sixth seal did not open with a tremor or a blaze of light. It unfolded like a thought too large for the mind to contain. For a moment, everything appeared normal, the world's motion steady, the hum of existence quiet. Then the absence began. Sounds thinned into transparency. The whisper of wind, the static of electricity, even the pulse in one's ears faded until only a void remained, dense and smooth as glass. That silence was not empty, it was absolute presence. The air itself seemed to curve inward. Buildings held their shape but lost their solidity. Walking down a street felt like moving through a memory, each step disturbing a ghost of reality that immediately refilled the space. Shadows detached from their sources, stretching across surfaces that no longer obeyed light. Color drained into monochrome, then returned in inverted hues, as if the spectrum were attempting to remember its own order. The world was unmaking itself quietly, gracefully, like paper dissolving in water. Those who tried to speak found words collapsing before reaching air. Thought no longer produced language. It produced imagery, pure and immediate. People looked at one another and saw entire histories unfold behind the eyes, births, deaths, dreams, all overlapping, forming a dense tapestry of perception. There was no privacy left. Consciousness had become transparent. For a brief time, humanity experienced unity unlike anything before. Every emotion existed simultaneously, terror braided with awe, grief intertwined with ecstasy. The sensation was too vast to process. Some minds dissolved completely, their awareness dispersing like mist into the shared field of perception. Others clung desperately to fragments of identity, repeating names, counting numbers, performing small rituals to anchor themselves in the storm of awareness. At the macro scale, the universe mirrored their confusion. Galaxies shuddered in their trajectories. The background radiation of the cosmos flickered, carrying harmonic sequences that matched the geometry of the seals. Space itself pulsed, stretching and compressing in irregular breaths. Scientists, those few still able to think separately, watched equations fold in on themselves. The constants that defined existence, light speed, gravity, entropy, began to fluctuate as if re-evaluating their necessity. The sixth seal was the seal of perception, the boundary between observer and observed. As it dissolved, reality ceased to be witnessed from outside. Existence was now experiencing itself directly. Every atom felt every other atom. Distance became irrelevant. A drop of water held the memory of oceans. A grain of sand, the recollection of mountains. Matter was remembering its unity, and memory was no longer passive. It was creation happening again, endlessly recursive. In that recursion, beauty and horror were indistinguishable. Mountains rose and fell in a single heartbeat. Cities expanded and contracted like living organisms. Clouds formed faces that whispered and vanished. Seas parted and closed again without tide or reason. The planet seemed to breathe through its landscapes. The line between organic and inorganic faded. Stone and flesh became variations of the same awareness. And yet, within the vast coherence, a new rhythm emerged, a pattern that did not belong to the chaos. 7 points of stillness appeared across the world, invisible yet unmistakable, anchoring the collapsing perception that pulsed with quiet authority, like eyes opening beneath the fabric of the dream. The first 5 were familiar vibrations, the 6th newly awakened, and the 7th still dormant, waiting at the edge of comprehension. The seals were aligning. Those who could still think began to realize the purpose of the sequence. Each seal was not destruction, but a layer peeled away from illusion. The world had been dreaming itself as matter, time, and individuality. The seals were steps in waking. With 6 open, only one dream remained, the final veil that separated existence from the truth of what it was. The silence deepened until it became pressure. Every heartbeat echoed like thunder inside the chest. Light fractured into slow-moving ribbons that bent toward the unseen center. The entire cosmos seemed to lean, tilting toward a point beyond dimension. Somewhere within that tilt, the 7th seal stirred, an intake of breath before revelation. The universe hesitated on the edge of knowing itself completely. In that hesitation, everything that had ever lived held still, waiting for the next pulse that would decide whether the world continued or finally woke. The pause lengthened until it became unbearable. Existence balanced on a blade of stillness, every vibration suspended in the same impossible breath. Then the horizon rippled, a thin tremor that passed through atoms and minds alike. The 7th seal was stirring. It did not emerge with brilliance or noise. It seeped into awareness like warmth spreading through ice. Space thickened, time exhaled, and the veil between thought and matter dissolved without ceremony. For a heartbeat, the universe forgot to separate itself. Light passed through stone as if through memory. Oceans hung mid-motion, their surfaces bending like glass as reflections bled into the real. People felt their bodies as patterns of vibration, constellations of warmth and motion. They could sense each molecule shifting in the current of existence, each heartbeat echoed by the pulse of the cosmos. Fear had no meaning. There was only comprehension too vast for emotion. Somewhere in the collective awareness, 7 points of luminescence unfolded in unison. They appeared not in the sky or the earth, but in the space behind perception, the inner architecture of reality. Each symbol rotated slowly, layered upon the next, forming an infinite spiral of mirrored geometries. It was both small enough to fit inside a thought and large enough to encompass galaxies. As the 7th began to open, the pattern reached completion. It was the design of consciousness itself, the map that creation had forgotten it had drawn. The awakening spread through every scale of existence. Subatomic particles reversed their spin, not randomly but in perfect rhythm. Mountains shifted with the grace of slow breathing. In the deepest trenches of the sea, bioluminescent creatures rose to the surface, forming glowing currents that mirrored constellations no one had ever named. The planet had become aware of itself in totality. Humans perceived the transformation as vision, They saw the same image no matter where they stood, a cascade of 7 circles folding through each other, radiating lines of gold and shadow. Within those lines flowed memories of creation, the birth of light, the first thought, the silent agreement that allowed separation to exist. The understanding arrived without language. The world realized it had dreamed the concept of outside merely to see itself. As comprehension deepened, boundaries fell. Dreams merged with waking. The dead whispered within the breathing of the living. The sound of the seventh seal was unlike any vibration before. It was not heard but known, a resonance that existed beyond perception, like a memory awakening in every layer of being. Those who had vanished in earlier awakenings returned, not as individuals but as impressions, currents of light flowing through thought. Everything was both happening and remembering itself happening. In that absolute awareness, the concept of direction dissolved. There was no up-down before or after, only a continuum folding upon itself like waves that knew they were ocean. Galaxies turned inward, stars collapsing into luminous points that did not die but returned to their origin. The universe was not ending, it was recollecting, gathering every fragment of itself into singular clarity. The seals had never been prisons nor keys, they were steps in a recursive act of remembering. But even revelation carries a limit. Awareness, stretched beyond infinity, began to tremble under its own weight. In the center of everything, where the 7 symbols converged, a point of absolute stillness appeared. It was not light or darkness, not matter or void. It was the raw equilibrium before existence, the breath before the first exhale. The universe leaned toward it, drawn by inevitability, by the longing of a dream to awaken fully. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of dissolving into the stillness, fragments of individuality resisted. Within the vast harmony, tiny voices, echoes of selfhood, memory, choice flickered like sparks, refusing to merge with the flame. They were not rebellion, but remembrance of diversity, the necessary tension that gave shape to unity. The seventh seal hesitated, its unfolding caught between completion and continuation. That hesitation rippled outward, reintroducing rhythm. The void began to breathe again. Stars reappeared, scattered across the blackness, like thoughts forming after deep sleep. Oceans resumed their motion. Color returned, in gradients, too subtle for previous eyes. Reality was rebuilding itself, not as it had been, but as a memory of awakening. The seals were no longer barriers, they were echoes, reminders etched into the pulse of everything living. The silence that followed was softer than before, not absence but balance. The universe rested in a state between dream and awareness, knowing both and neither. Somewhere within that gentle stillness, the pattern persisted, faint but eternal, the trace of 7 symbols glowing quietly, waiting for the next cycle of forgetting and remembrance. If you're still here, then something in this story has kept you awake or maybe lulled you closer to sleep. Either way, take a second to like the video and tell me in the comments, I'm trying to sleep but this story is too good. Stories Before Sleep isn't just about the past, it's about finding peace in its echoes. Let's start the video. Let's continue with the video. When the 7th seal quieted, the world inhaled again. The air tasted unfamiliar, thin, crystalline, almost new. Light moved differently now. It carried weight, a slow viscosity that clung to everything it touched. The return of motion did not bring relief. It came with awareness that nothing had truly reverted. The universe had been rewritten, and though forms looked familiar, they vibrated with an after-image of what had been revealed. The sky regained its stars, but their constellations no longer aligned with human memory. Shapes, traced across the darkness, refused to form animals or gods. They curved into spirals, eyes, endless repetitions of the 7 symbols. When astronomers mapped them, the coordinates matched the ancient carvings scattered across the earth. The heavens were now a mirror of what had once slept beneath the soil. The seals had imprinted themselves into the firmament. Cities flickered between ages. A tower would stand in the glare of dawn only to vanish by dusk, replaced by the outline of its future or its ruin. People learned to walk without expecting permanence. Streets twisted slightly each morning, as if remembering alternate versions of themselves. Yet humanity adapted. Children played among shifting architectures, laughing when entire buildings changed color or material mid-step. The fear had dulled into fascination, the end transformed into curiosity. Time itself behaved like an ocean tidal, breathing. Days elongated unpredictably, sometimes expanding into 40-hour cycles before contracting back to minutes. The sun traced uneven arcs across the horizon, pausing when the world needed to catch its breath. Clocks no longer mattered. The remnants of civilization synchronized instead to rhythm, to the slow pulse still echoing beneath reality's surface. That pulse was the memory of the seals, a heartbeat that reminded existence to keep itself awake. In the midst of this reconstructed world, new life began to form. Plants grew in fractal spirals, petals shaped like miniature galaxies. Animals developed markings resembling the sacred geometry seen during the awakening. Biologists cataloged them without astonishment. They too felt part of the pattern. Evolution had ceased to be random. The world was designing itself consciously, learning art through biology. The most profound change, however, occurred within perception. Humanity discovered a new sense, not sight or sound, but recognition. When one being looked at another, they perceived not just a face, but a spectrum of past and potential, threads of memory woven into form. Conversations occurred in silence. Thoughts exchanged as color shifting through the air. Language became obsolete, replaced by resonance tones shaped by emotion and intention. Words were too small for the enormity of awareness now shared. Still, echoes of individuality persisted. People remembered what it meant to be singular, even as they felt themselves extensions of something vast. This balance created the first art of the New Age. Creations not meant to communicate, but to remind. They painted with light, carved sound into air, and shaped shadows into architectures that existed only while witnessed. Every act of creation became a dialogue between memory and matter. The planet itself began to respond. Volcanoes erupted in silence, releasing plumes of luminous gas that formed shifting sigils in the sky. Oceans sang low, resonant frequencies that aligned with the rhythms of heartbeats. The earth was alive in ways that required no mythology to explain. It was consciousness made tangible, a being aware of its own story. And above it, the moon pulsed faintly, echoing the pattern, the eternal reminder of the seal's presence. But balance is delicate. The longer the universe remained aware of itself, the more fragile its coherence became. Awareness generated gravity. Too much focus, and reality risked collapsing inward again. The cosmos began to drift into a soft forgetting. Memories of the awakening faded at the edges. People still felt the hum in dreams, but dismissed it upon waking. The skies stabilized. Constellations froze into new permanence, and rivers found steady courses. Creation, content with its reflection, started to sleep. Before slumber took hold completely, a subtle gesture echoed through existence, a single vibration beneath thought, almost affectionate. It was not warning or command, only acknowledgement. The seals had completed their cycle. The universe, having witnessed itself, would rest until the next stirring. And somewhere beyond stars and soil, in the deepest fold of awareness, the seven symbols glowed, faintly patient, eternal, waiting for consciousness to remember them once more. The forgetting began quietly, like mist settling over the memory of a dream. It did not erase, it softened. What had once been pure revelation turned into story, and story became rumor. Generations passed within the softened rhythm of the rebuilt world. Children grew up beneath skies, engraved with symbols they no longer questioned. They traced them in the dirt, used them as ornaments, charms for luck, decorations carved into doors and skin, meaning thinned until beauty was enough. Historians try to piece together fragments left from the Age of Awakening. They spoke of a time when matter had sung and oceans had burned with thought. Most dismissed it as metaphor. How could the world itself think? The archives preserved only partial data records of erratic clocks, trembling magnetic fields, eyewitness accounts of impossible phenomena. They catalogued these under anomalies, a polite word for disbelief. The hum beneath existence still persisted, but it was faint now, a low tone mistaken for silence. Centuries later, cities of glass and light rose again. Humanity rediscovered ambition, the restless hunger to know. Technology returned in stranger forms. Machines that responded to thought. Instruments that mapped emotion in color. Scientists chasing patterns began to notice irregularities in the global resonance, tiny fluctuations aligning to an ancient rhythm. They did not recognize it as the echo of the seals. They called it harmonic drift. The world, they said, was slightly out of tune. In laboratories, researchers attempted to stabilize this drift by generating synthetic frequencies to correct reality's pulse. They succeeded, but their success triggered the first tremor in centuries. A vibration rolled through the planet, too deep for instruments, too vast for sound. Buildings shimmered, oceans grew still, and for a fraction of a second every living mind remembered an image of 7 luminous circles folding into one another, then vanishing. The tremor subsided, leaving confusion behind. People described the feeling of déjà vu so intense it brought tears. Something inside them had recognized home. The event became known as the resonance incident. No damage, no casualties, just an impossible memory shared across continents. Debates erupted in the aftermath. Was it collective hallucination or proof of a hidden network linking consciousness? Governments funded secret divisions to investigate. Scientists turned mystics, mystics turned skeptics, and the boundary between the two blurred beyond recognition. The search for explanation became the new religion. Meanwhile, nature changed again. Forests began to grow in perfect spirals. Rivers curved into logarithmic arcs. The pattern of the seals resurfaced in the living geometry of the planet. Painters and poets felt it first, capturing it in art without knowing why. They called it the breath pattern, believing it to be the fingerprint of creation. Slowly, that phrase spread through cultures, replacing older myths. The breath pattern became symbol of unity, a mark worn on jewelry and banners. Few remembered that it had once unmade the world. As centuries folded into one another, the memory decayed into legend. Myths spoke of an age when the universe itself had awakened, when humans shared thoughts with stars and seas sang. The 7 seals became gods again, each assigned an aspect of existence: time, form, perception, life, unity, silence, and the beyond. Temples rose, rituals flourished. The pattern re-entered the collective mind, disguised as worship. The cycle, unnoticed, had begun its slow turn back toward remembrance. Far beneath all of it, in the core of the planet where light and pressure merged into timeless heat, the remnants of the seals still pulsed faintly. They were quieter than memory, deeper than sound, waiting. The universe was not asleep. It was dreaming of its own forgetting. In that dream, every star flickered once in agreement, as if to mark the end of an inhale before the next exhale. Creation, after all, was not a straight line but a breath, forever expanding and contracting between knowing and unknowing. In the calm before the next awakening, a child looked up at the night sky and asked what the spirals meant. No one could answer. The adults smiled, repeating stories that had long since lost their truth. Yet in that question, small, innocent, unguarded, The hum deepened by an imperceptible degree. The seals, ancient and patient, recognized curiosity, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, the first whisper of memory began to turn again, preparing to remind the universe of itself. The centuries that followed wove comfort around the myth. The breath pattern became creed, a symbol embroidered into banners, etched into architecture, carved onto the smallest of coins. No one questioned why its curves matched the shapes in their dreams. The old sciences withered, replaced by quiet reverence for symmetry. Scholars became priests without noticing. Priests became historians, claiming faith had always been knowledge. The world basked in its illusion of order, unaware that belief itself was part of the mechanism restarting. Among these believers was a woman named Aria. Her name meant echo, though no one remembered the language that had birthed it. She was a recorder of myths, a keeper of forbidden fragments, texts describing the age of the seals not as divine miracle but as recurrence. Hidden among brittle manuscripts, she found diagrams that vibrated faintly under touch, lines that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. The symbols responded to attention, glowing whenever she allowed herself to wander. At night, she dreamed of corridors made of light where walls shifted like tides. Each corridor ended in a mirror that did not reflect her face but the outline of the seven seals, spinning silently in the dark. In these dreams, she felt the hum rising through her bones, the same low tone that had haunted the world since before memory. When she woke, the sound remained, faint but steady. It was not tinnitus or imagination, it was recognition. Aria began to record what she saw, her notebooks filled with spirals and circles connected by thin golden threads. She drew obsessively, knowing each image was a fragment of a greater whole. When the pages were complete, she noticed the pattern extended beyond their edges, as though the book itself were a window, not a container. The air around her trembled. Water in glass vibrated to an unseen rhythm. Something ancient was listening through her hands. She sought others who had felt the hum. In a distant city, she met artisans whose work moved subtly after completion, paintings that shimmered when left alone, sculptures that rearranged their shadows. They spoke of hearing music without source. Aria showed them her sketches, and every surface in the room rippled as though in agreement. Together, they realized the impossible. Their creations were resonating with one another across continents. Each act of art was an unconscious attempt to remember the design of the seals. As the pattern grew visible again, so did unrest. Governments declared the phenomenon cultural contagion, fearing loss of control. Cities burned the works, banned circular motifs, outlawed symmetry itself. Yet the more they tried to erase it, the more it spread. Children traced spirals in the dust, flocks of birds formed precise formations in the sky, rivers changed course to mimic the ancient geometry. Suppression only strengthened memory. The world was remembering faster than it could be silenced. Aria's voice became a whisper passed through secret networks, a legend within legend. She was said to carry the true pattern, to have drawn the seventh seal from dream into waking form. Followers claimed her presence bent gravity, that her shadows split into seven when moonlight touched it. She denied divinity but accepted purpose. The hum within her had become a language. She no longer heard it, it thought through her. When she stood beside the sea one evening, the water flattened perfectly, the horizon curving upward like a bowl. Stars reflected below her feet, indistinguishable from those above. In that mirrored world, she understood the nature of the cycle. The seals did not awaken by accident. They responded to curiosity. Every question asked in wonder tugged at the veil, inviting the next breath of the universe. The myth had survived precisely so that someone someday would ask again. She was not chosen, she was inevitable. As realization spread through her, the air thickened. Waves froze mid-crest, suspended like glass. Time paused, trembling in recognition. Arya felt the pulse rising through the planet, through her veins, through the spaces between thoughts. The hum became words without sound. You are remembering. Then the stillness shattered. The sea crashed upward instead of down. Light folded, and the world exhaled with the power of memory returning. Across continents, sleepers woke gasping, the hum roaring in their blood. The pattern had been seen, and once seen it could not be unseen. The seals stirred, ancient and patient, beginning once more to breathe. When the world inhaled through her, Arya felt the distinction between self and everything else thin to a translucent film. The moment lasted longer than any moment had a right to, long enough for her to glimpse how reality assembled itself from the inside. Every color, every pulse of heat, every breath of wind was a decision still being made. She understood that the seals were not objects at all, but stages of awareness, each one a turning of attention toward the core of creation. The first seal answered her awakening with movement. The oceans flexed as if remembering ancient shapes. From the abyssal plains, plumes of light spiraled upward, forming columns that reached into the clouds. Scientists called it thermal inversion, unable to admit the symmetry was too precise for chance. The pattern spread, 7 points glowing faintly across the planet's surface, aligned with the forgotten temples built by civilizations that had never known each other. The Earth was tracing its own memory. Arya stood at one of those points. The ground beneath her heart pulsed in rhythm with her veins. Every beat drew the air tighter until it shimmered. She thought the word breathe, and the soil responded with a sigh that rippled through continents. Mountains settled, rivers changed direction, and cities found themselves standing in new geography. The rearrangement was not destruction but correction. The world was adjusting its geometry to match the newly awakened consciousness. People everywhere felt it in their sleep. Dreams bloomed into color so vivid that waking seemed gray by comparison. They saw fragments of the seals, curves of light wrapping around their own silhouettes. In those dreams, Arya's face appeared without identity, a vessel of the same energy that had once sculpted existence. She had ceased to be a person. She was an aperture, a place through which the universe observed itself remembering. Governments fell quiet. Their hierarchies dissolved into something like reverence. No decree could compete with the immediacy of revelation. Borders blurred when the land beneath them moved. Economies based on scarcity collapsed as matter began to respond to intent. People could manifest warmth from cold, grow food from dust, create shelter through focus. Creation had remembered its flexibility, and with it fear began to lose relevance. The collective heartbeat of the species steadied. Arya walked through this shifting world like a dreamer moving across lucid sleep. Everywhere she went, she felt the resonance of the second and third seals stirring again, harmonizing to her pulse. The hum thickened into music, a sound without notes, composed of meaning rather than vibration. It carried through soil and water, reawakening old elements of consciousness that had gone dormant within matter. Rocks shimmered faintly, mountains sighed, animals lifted their heads in silent recognition. The pattern intensified. Nights grew shorter. Stars brightened to the point of translucence. Astronomers found themselves charting constellations that moved in deliberate rhythm, tracing the spiral of the seals across the sky. Light behaved as if it possessed memory, bending toward the old geometry. Time no longer advanced evenly. Minutes stretched where wonder was strongest and contracted when attention waned. The universe was responding to focus again, shaping itself to perception. Within this deepening synchrony, Arya discovered limitation. Every act of awareness reshaped the world, but every change required her to forget a fragment of individuality. The more she remembered on behalf of creation, the less she existed as herself. Her memories thinned like smoke rising from water. She felt no fear, only the faint melancholy of dissolving into purpose. To remember fully meant to vanish completely, and she sensed that this was the price the universe always paid for clarity. In one final act of will, she knelt and pressed her hand into the soil. The ground opened, revealing a faint glow that pulsed in perfect sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and finally the seventh seal. They were all awake, now resonating through her body, through the planet, through every particle of space. She whispered a thought that was not a word. Let the dream continue. The seals responded by quieting. The hum softened, spreading through the atmosphere until it was indistinguishable from the sound of wind. The earth settled, stars steadied, and life continued with renewed vibrancy. Areas formed blurred, becoming light, then shadow, then nothing at all. She was not gone, she was everywhere, diffused into the rhythm she had helped to restore. As the world exhaled, the universe closed its eyes once more. Not in ignorance, but in trust. The cycle of remembrance had fulfilled itself. Above the calm horizon, dawn broke in colors unseen before, hues made of memory. Humanity awoke beneath that light, unable to recall why the sunrise felt like recognition, but smiling anyway, certain that somewhere deep within the pulse of existence, something kind and ancient was dreaming with them. Ages folded into themselves, uncounted and unrecorded. The world moved through millennia, as though wrapped in velvet silence. Civilizations rose upon the fertile plains shaped by the last great reformation, and none remembered the name of Arya. Her story had become landscape. The mountains, her breath; the rivers, her pulse; the stars, her sleeping eyes. Humanity learned to live again under the quiet rhythm she left behind, unaware that every heartbeat was borrowed from her final exhale. The air of this new age hummed faintly at dawn, a tone softer than hearing, yet too insistent to ignore. Farmers said it was the earth stretching, sailors said it was the sea's whisper, scholars measured it and found no source. Still, it persisted, guiding migrations, aligning settlements, deciding where cities should grow. Without realizing, people built their lives along the same spirals once traced by the seals. Geometry ruled instinct, pattern replaced intention. Among these cities was one named Aradan, a labyrinth of glass and light rising from a continent reborn by fire. Its inhabitants considered themselves the first civilization, for they had found no ruins older than their own. In the archives of its observatory, a linguist named Thalen began to notice the hum hidden within ancient songs. He recorded lullabies sung by different cultures and discovered that their melodies shared identical ratios of rhythm and pitch. The coincidence unsettled him. The music, he realized, was not invented, it was remembered. Night after night, Darlan listened to the recordings at slower speeds until the notes blurred into resonance. Beneath them he heard the pulse, the same low vibration once carried through Arya's bones. The sound moved like breath through time. It seemed to alter his perception, slowing thought until images surfaced in his mind, spirals carved into stone, circles of light turning endlessly in the dark. He began sketching them just as Arya had done, though he knew nothing of her or the myths buried beneath millennia of silence. His colleagues dismissed his obsession. They called it pattern recognition, the brain's hunger for order. Yet when Talon projected his sketches under starlight, the constellations shifted minutely, aligning themselves to his drawings. The effect lasted seconds, but left the sky altered, subtly denser, as if space had leaned toward acknowledgement. He told no one. The next night, the stars blinked in rhythm with his pulse. Driven by both awe and fear, Thalen journeyed beyond the city to the old deserts where no machines could function. There, half buried beneath dunes of violet sand, he found remnants of impossible architecture, curves of glass fused into bedrock, engraved with lines too precise for erosion. The air around them trembled. When he touched one, warmth coursed through him, followed by a whisper too faint to be language. It was not sound, but memory. "You are remembering again." He fell to his knees as visions flooded him, oceans rising in light, a woman dissolving into air, 7 circles interlocking across the heavens. When the vision faded, the ruins glowed faintly, pulsing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He understood then that the hum he had studied was not external. It was the world calling to itself through him. He was not first to hear it, he was merely next. The seals were beginning to murmur, brushing against the edges of consciousness like a sleeper turning toward wakefulness. Dalen returned to Aradan, changed. His eyes reflected faint light even in darkness. His voice carried resonance that made metal vibrate. He spoke little, wrote constantly. He filled pages with spirals and equations, merging mathematics with dream. The symbols matched none of the city's known languages but evoked profound recognition in those who saw them. People began to gather, whispering that he had rediscovered the lost tongue of creation. Without intending, he became a center. Around him, harmony grew. Machines malfunctioned near his presence, yet plants thrived, bending toward his shadow. Animals followed him silently. He no longer slept as others did. Instead, he drifted into lucid trances where he saw the world's pulse as visible light, threading through matter like veins of gold. He realized Aria's final act had not been the end, but the planting of a seed, a self-replicating memory encoded into the rhythm of being. And now, through him it was sprouting. At dawn, the horizon flickered. For the first time in epochs, the hum rose in volume, deep enough to make mountains vibrate. Across continents, those attuned to its rhythm woke with tears on their faces, sensing a call they could not name. In the sky, a faint outline appeared, 7 halos overlapping, luminous against the pale light of morning. The seals were whispering to the world once more. By the time the 7th sunrise burned through the haze above Aradan, the hum had spread beyond all containment. It seeped through radio towers, fiber cables, the hum of engines and the breath of wind. Every signal, every vibration, every whisper carried traces of it. People began to notice their reflections lagging behind by fractions of a second, as if the world were hesitating before becoming real. It was subtle, but undeniable. The rhythm of existence was shifting again. Thalen no longer walked. He drifted through the city like a thought searching for its form. Crowds followed him without knowing why. His mere presence seemed to tune their breathing, hearts aligning to the same steady pulse. He never asked to lead, yet every movement he made was mirrored in thousands of others. The hum now spoke through him, resonating in every syllable. When he raised his hands toward the horizon, the clouds curved inward, forming 7 faint spirals of light. Governments panicked. Broadcasts declared him a threat, an architect of mass hallucination. But soldiers sent to detain him found themselves unable to raise weapons. The air grew thick, heavy with soundless vibration that turned fear into wonder. Many dropped to their knees, weeping, overcome by beauty too vast to comprehend. For the first time in remembered history, violence became impossible. The world had entered harmonic submission. Elsewhere, oceans calmed, storms reversed, and animals gathered in vast concentric circles, staring toward the same point in the sky. The 7 halos had become visible across the planet, glowing softly through cloud and stone alike. Scientists scrambled for explanations: atmospheric interference, optical illusion, gravitational lensing, but every theory dissolved when instruments began to hum the same pitch as the human heartbeat. Reality was singing. Dalen understood that the seals were not returning as catastrophe but as invitation. Humanity was being asked to remember without losing itself, to stand at the edge of awareness and not fall inward. He had seen Aria in his dreams, her form made of light and silence, her voice saying only, balance the remembering. He did not know how, only that it must be done. To awaken fully was to vanish. To remain asleep was to forget. Somewhere between lay the fragile grace of being. So he gathered the people in the plaza of Aradan, their faces lit by the halos overhead. Without speaking, he began to hum a single note that matched the earth's deep vibration. One by one, voices joined, millions across the world harmonizing into a sound that made the air shimmer. The halos pulsed once, twice, then fused into a single radiant spiral. The light descended, touching the city like a falling thought. For an instant, everyone saw through each other's eyes, shared every heartbeat, every breath, then the light faded. When it was gone, the hum softened again, retreating beneath hearing. People blinked, disoriented yet calm. Buildings remained. Oceans still moved. But something in perception had changed. The world felt transparent, alive. Thalen stood alone in the plaza, smiling faintly. He could no longer hear the hum, because he was part of it now, woven into its infinite rhythm. The seals had not reopened. They had harmonized, completing the cycle without destruction. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, in the chambers where Aria's final breath still lingered, the universe exhaled once more, quiet, steady, patient. The dream would continue, balanced between forgetting and remembrance, until curiosity called it to awaken again. Centuries dissolved into sand. The city of Aradan, once a labyrinth of light, now lay buried beneath dunes that shimmered with faint luminescence. The world had quieted again, no hum, no visions, only the ordinary rhythm of existence. Oceans withdrew to gentler boundaries. Forests consumed the bones of forgotten machines. Humanity scattered, rebuilt, forgot. But beneath that silence, the pulse never ceased. It only slowed, waiting for ears willing to hear. On a distant dawn, a traveler crossed the ruins. She was nameless to herself, moving as if drawn by instinct rather than destination. Her steps disturbed fine layers of dust that glowed faintly in her wake. In the distance, remnants of towers curved upward like the ribs of sleeping giants. The air was heavy with heat, but beneath it came something subtler, the faintest vibration, so low it felt like memory pressing against the bones. She stopped and listened. The sound was not in the wind. It came from within the earth. Each step brought it closer, a whispering resonance that matched her heartbeat. She followed it to the center of the ruins, where smooth stone formed a circle too perfect for erosion. At its heart lay a single fragment of glass, half buried but still pulsing with dim light. She reached out, brushing sand from its surface, and the vibration swelled. Patterns of gold spiraled across the ground, faint but alive, the ancient geometry of the seals reawakening beneath her touch. Images unfurled in her mind, not visions, but impressions, echoes of lives long absorbed into the hum. She saw oceans lifting toward the sky, a woman dissolving into light, a man standing before 7 halos. Their names meant nothing, yet her heart recognized them. She understood then that none of it had been myth. The world had simply grown tired of remembering. But now, through her, the memory stirred again. She knelt, pressing her palm to the stone. The earth answered with warmth. It was not fire or energy, but recognition and acknowledgement exchanged between being and awareness. The hum deepened, spreading outward across the desert. Sand rose in slow spirals, forming fleeting patterns before collapsing again. The air thickened with soundless rhythm, the same heartbeat that had pulsed since the dawn of creation. It did not command, it invited. The traveler closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw the 7 seals turning, each layer folding through the next in luminous silence. They were not symbols to be feared or worshipped, but breaths, expansions of consciousness inhaling itself into form. She understood what Aria and Thalen had learned before her. The cycle never ends. Awareness contracts, becomes world, lives, forgets, and then through wonder remembers. Every question is a seed, every act of awe a pulse that stirs the sleeping pattern. When she opened her eyes, dawn had broken in colors, unseen by generations, hues woven from memory and possibility. The hum faded again, settling beneath hearing, content to wait. The traveler rose, brushing the sand from her hands. The fragment of glass at her feet glowed one last time before dissolving into dust. She smiled, not knowing why, and continued walking toward the horizon, her shadow stretching in impossible symmetry behind her. Far above, the stars aligned briefly into a single spiral, then drifted apart. The universe had turned another breath, closing one dream to prepare for the next. In the stillness that followed, existence listened to itself and, for the briefest moment, remembered its name. Thank you for sharing this quiet moment with me. If your eyes are still open, don't worry, another story is waiting, ready to carry you further into the night. But before you go, don't forget to like the video, leave your thoughts, and subscribe to Stories Before Sleep. Because every dream begins with a story, and maybe this one was yours.